Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Broadcast Network. I'm your host, Davis Ellington, here getting ready. Fantasy football is back. I'm excited. I know you're excited. This is the best time of the year, draft season, just finishing up here, only a couple days left. And if you just haven't gotten your fantasy drafts in quite yet, we're going to touch on some strategies for you going in. And if you already have, well, then you can look back and see what you did right and see maybe if you have some new notes for next season or if you got another league coming up, as that's going to be our beginning of the podcast here. And as we look over the draft strategies, we're going to assume here on the GSMC podcast that you're going to have a 12-team league. We're going to assume, for most likely, PPR. Points per reception has been the big thing lately in fantasy football. So we're going to work from that mindset. Of course, things might be slightly different. If you only have 10 teams in a league, of course, your drafts are going to be of better players because less players are taken. And if you're drafting in one of those crazy 14-team leagues, then the pickings are slim much quicker. But we're going to start with as if you're going into a 12-team draft. So we're going to look at where you're drafting in this league and where exactly is the best place for you to go with your picks based on your probability of just making the playoffs. To remind everyone, if you're going to win a fantasy football championship, most likely, as long as everyone is awake and there on Sunday to watch their team, you got to win on the waiver wire and in the free agent market. No team has ever really won based off of a draft, but you sure can lose on draft day. That is for sure. So we're going to try to navigate you through that and give you a shot to have a team that's playoff bound, and then with a couple tweaks here and there, some really good ads on your part. If you keep listening here on the Fantasy Football Podcast, we'll have those sleepers for you as the season goes on. But that's how you're going to get the almighty crown and get that football Super Bowl ring for yourself. But we're going to start here talking about draft styles and draft orders. If you have one of those top picks, right, with Ezekiel Elliott signing, he's now pretty much locked in that top 4 spot with his other elite running back company. We're talking Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, and of course Alvin Kamara are the top 4 picks. Really, there's no one fighting him on that one there unless your league has some crazy point system. That's what you're going to go with. And if you're going to open with one of those picks, you're going to get the comeback from the snake draft. You're going to be picking in the mid to early 20s probably. You know, if you have Saquon, you have that number 1 pick, you're going to be picking 24th. You're going to drop into a spot where maybe a good running back can slip to you there. There's no problems with double tapping the running back early, right? You make that position solid, then you can work on wide receivers, tight ends as you go. But don't forget about some of the good wide receivers down there. Amari Cooper, Adam Thielen. These are guys that are slipping into that late second round spot. Thielen you might even be able to get even later. Same with Cooper. Depends on what the people do in front of you to draft. But you have that 2-pick spot there if you're picking early. So maybe getting 2 wide receivers right there and really just ironing out your wide receiver core. I like to go with that move. There's a lot of running back talent late, and with so many pass-catching running backs in the league, you don't need to grab your first 2 picks as running backs. And if you at least grab 1 wide receiver in that double up spot, it keeps you very open. You can react to the way people pick. Too many people go with that running back combo to start, especially picking in the middle of this draft. If you're picking 4th and you have Zeke, or maybe 5th with David Johnson, These are guys that if you grab your running back there, and then on the comeback, maybe you grab a Joe Mixon, perhaps he's right about at that spot there, or a Kerryon Johnson. Maybe if people are worried about his knee, you grab him with your second-round pick. Great find there. But now you got 2 running backs, and everyone in the league knows you have to pick a wide receiver. You want to try, if you can, to avoid being very open with where you have to go, because if anyone in your league is just thinking about that, then if I'm drafting behind you, let's say, and I know you have 2 wide receivers already, I know you're picking a running back. So when it's coming my way, I can let a running back go, knowing that at that I'm going to get that kickback and the guy I want is still going to be there, right? Because you have to address an obvious need in your draft. The first 2 rounds, of course, so important, mathematically speaking, and analytically speaking. The second round pick of any fantasy football draft is the most important, so I would advise that you go with a very dependable player. That's why the Todd Gurley pick in the second, with his knee issues, with the fact that the Rams drafted a running back in the 3rd round, and they've been a little cagey about his injury so far, that's a sign of worry. If he gets hurt and you don't handcuff him properly with Darrell Henderson, you could be in for a tough season. I always recommend in the second round grabbing that dependable guy. There's a lot of wide receivers that I think can be those guys, those rocks for you. Juju Smith-Schuster, a big-bodied wide receiver. Same with guys like Michael Thomas, are those guys that are on the edge. They're facing corners that are 5'9", 5'10". They're 6'3", 6'4". They have so much mass, it's tougher for them to get hurt. They're not running in between the tackles as much, and because of that, they're going to be on the field for you more often than maybe guys at some other positions, some undersized players if they get hurt. Tyreek Hill, I love Tyreek Hill. He's explosive. He can win you a week, but at his size, he had a little calf issue during that's baseball, during training camp for the Chiefs. What's he going to be? If I can get him late second round, I might take a flyer on him. But if there's a more dependable guy sitting there on the draft board, I'm going to go with the guy I know is a much safer pick. He's sure points, and sure points in fantasy football is what you want. So many players, and you'll see this in your drafts, or maybe you already have, so many fantasy football players are so excited about the big play threat guys, the Tyreek Hills of the world, the guys that out of nowhere can go for an 80-yard touchdown. And as cool as that is to have on your team, it comes at a price. But if you can get a guy like Michael Thomas, I love him from the Saints. He has another year in that Sean Payton offense with Drew Brees. He is an absolute workhorse for that team. They're going to keep him healthy. He's going to be on the field for you every single week. So just keep that in mind when you're drafting. You got to have guys that are low injury risks, especially in those higher draft slots. Those first 5 picks need to be starters for you. At least 4 out of 5 of them should be. You can take a risk at the 5 spot or in the 4th round if you know you have a more dependable guy kind of hidden away on the back end. But that's just a little draft overview this season. We're going to get into more of individual personnel as this podcast goes on. And if you're drafting in that last spot, in those 10 to 12 spots there, you have a real interesting decision this season. There's going to be a couple running backs. Leonard Fournette ranked really low, of course. Derrick Henry had a great season. You're not going to go down and get these guys round 1, but it's something to think about. Do you reach down there and grab somebody at that running back spot because they might not make it back on the turn? Or you can get 2 fantastic wide receivers, and if you do that, I know that's a little taboo. Everyone likes to make sure they get that stalwart running back in one of their first 2 picks. But if you think about it like this, if you're able to grab, let's say, Michael Thomas and Juju Smith-Schuster at the 11 spot, right? You have 2 guys. You don't have to worry about receivers for the rest of your draft, for the rest of your season. Possibly, if they both stay healthy, you're not going to start anyone over those 2 guys, as they're both potential number 1 players at their position. You can focus your energy on running backs. Yes, it makes you a little bit more predictable because teams know you're not going to be drafting too many more wide receivers. But with all the running backs getting picked ahead of you, there might be some coming down to you in that 3rd, 4th round spot. You could see guys like Sony Michel, Derrick Henry are going to probably slip down. Phillip Lindsay should be available for you in about the 5th round area if you're a little lucky and you go down and snag him. And these are running backs that are going to catch passes. James White, of course, the other back in that Patriots backfield. These are guys that are going to catch passes. Josh Jacobs is going to be a dual threat running back for the Raiders. And they can sustain an offense for you. They can mitigate most of the big running backs in the league by just making their big games hurt a little less, and then you can smoke people by having 2 outstanding wide receivers. Couple that, of course, with good tight end and good quarterback play, and you could be off to the races. So there's a lot of different strategies going on, but it's those first 2 picks that are really going to set the tone for your team this season. And as always, make sure that you have dependable guys. I always go dependability over excitement, just to make sure that come week 16, you're in the hunt because you've been getting production day in and day out from your top weapons. And we're going to keep talking about fantasy football here on the GSMC Podcast Network. We're just going to take a short break and come right back and get you ready for week 1 of the NFL and week 1 of fantasy football. I'm Davis Ellington, and this is the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Of course, I'm your host, Davis Ellington, back in here again. We talked a little bit about some draft strategy going on for your fantasy football seasons that have hopefully already started or about to begin with your draft coming up. And we want to talk about a little more strategy, a little more in-depth about some certain players and how exactly you're going to deal with this come draft day. Now, wide receivers are a little more cut and dry. They're very grouped. They're pretty obvious who's great, who's decent, who is going to be more of a sleeper, and we can, of course, touch in on that. But the big one for this season, of course, is the running backs. And it's going to be kicked off right here. We're going to talk about Todd Gurley, the man who's been carrying the workload for the Rams backfield for some seasons now, and he has been fantastic. He's been one of the best backs we've seen in fantasy football for a while now. He's been dual threat. He's gotten so many carries, but this season could be different for the former Georgia running back, as Sean McVay has talked about limiting his usage. Gurley, of course, was very obviously absent from the Super Bowl. He played a little bit, but was basically a non-factor, giving a lot of carries away to C.J. Anderson in that contest. And with his shaky knee injury history and the fact that the Rams have made these statements about lightening his workload, trying to keep him fresh for the playoffs, as well as drafting Henderson in the 3rd round, another rookie running back who has been very high on draft boards as far as sleepers and handcuffs go, it's interesting to see Gurley's value has really dropped. A guy who has been the consensus number 1 pick for a while now is now sitting at around the low 2nd round pick just because of that shakiness. And I talked about it earlier with the fact that the 2nd round pick for any fantasy football league is statistically the most important because that's where the greatest difference is in points. Guys in the 2nd round of fantasy football are going to be on very opposite ends of the spectrum as far as point production. You're going to have guys that are going to be number 1 potentially at their position come the end of the season. You can also find guys that are completely irrelevant come the end of the season, whether it's injury or just lack of production, terrible offensive schemes or what have you. Then they run into a wall of being just not feasible to play for you on Sundays and Mondays, and then your fantasy football team takes that hit because you have to replace that valued position of your draft. So you got to be careful in that second round. So Gurley's a bit of a risk. If he hits, that's the stuff that'll win you a fantasy football championship. That gamble, if it pays off, your team could be unstoppable if you can pair him with another great running back or maybe a couple top-end wide receivers. But that Gurley move is just something it's an emotional gut check. You got to be willing to risk it. He's a guy that he's going to be very efficient, whether he gets 80 touches or 60 touches or however many he's going to get, however many snaps he's going to be in on the percentages, he's going to get you points. Just the question is how many. He's probably not going to be the insane juggernaut of fantasy power that we've seen from him over the last couple seasons, but that does not mean he's going to be irrelevant by any stretch of the imagination. And then we move on. There's a couple other running backs that are going to be interesting to look at. You got Joe Mixon out of the Cincinnati Bengals backfield. He's a guy that people really have been sleeping on a little bit. He's had a couple really good seasons. He had a solid one last season back in 2018, and now with A.J. Green being hurt and him really emerging in that offense, look for Joe Mixon to surprise a lot of people and have a really big season. And he's a guy you can get in that middle round, so if you get one of the top-end running backs or if you grab like a David Johnson guy just outside of that elite backfield area, you might be able to pair him with a Joe Mixon and have a really gnarly 1-2 punch. Or, of course, you could grab a top-end wide receiver, grab Joe Mixon, and have a real versatile beginning to your draft. But Mixon's a guy to watch. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. He's running in that Andy Dalton offense, so you know he's going to be leaned on heavily for offensive production. Fournette, another guy I personally am very high on this season. He's done everything right to try to come back from what was an atrocious season in 2018. He doesn't want to remember it. We won't go over it too much. His production just fell drastically. He was having physical ailments. He was injured. He made statements that his personal life was bothering him as well, but he seems to have rectified all of these situations, and he's coming in with a clear mind here into this next season for Jacksonville. Look for Leonard Fournette to get back to that promise of what he looked like coming out of LSU. Could be a really big turnaround season for number 27. And then, of course, a lot of people are asking, when do I draft Melvin Gordon? And the answer is it's a gamble. It depends on when you want to take that risk. I've seen him go as early as the third round for people that are confident he's going to play. I've seen him go as late as the fifth and sixth round when people as a league are just convinced that he is too much of a risk and there are better value players at that position. Now, Melvin Gordon most likely will play at some point of this season. That is not really in question. He has to play before Week 10 and then start playing for the team. Otherwise, this season doesn't count toward free agency, and he's just stuck with the same scenario come next season. So look for Melvin Gordon to play. The question, of course, is when. Now, because of that, if you draft Melvin Gordon thinking, well, come Week 10, I've got him, and then I can make my playoff push in those last couple weeks, you're betting on treading water for possibly 10 whole weeks. Those are 10 games without Melvin Gordon in your lineup, and if you use a higher round pick on him, that's value you're just not seeing. So think about it like this. If you take that third round pick out and then you draft your team, that's what you have. That's what you're going with. You're going without that high-value asset in your arsenal. Now, if you're able to draft another running back, we've seen guys, Derrick Henry, Sony Michel, are guys going in that third round as well, or early fourth round. If you have those guys for the entire season, you might win more games. You lock up the playoffs earlier. Melvin Gordon's a huge risk this season. We saw people taking that risk with Le'Veon Bell at the number 1 pick last season, and he didn't see a down for the Steelers, and fantasy football owners everywhere really had to bite the bullet on that one. And if you want to look away from Melvin Gordon, another guy in that second, third round conversation at running back that is an intriguing option for you is Kerryon Johnson from the Detroit Lions. Kerryon Johnson, now with Theo Riddick gone, is really being given the reins of that backfield. He's a dual threat guy as well out of Auburn. He's in that Matthew Stafford offense. Stafford has Golladay and now a healthy Marvin Jones to throw to. Rookie tight end TJ Hawkinson out of Iowa University is supposed to be the next big thing for them there. Remember, Eric Ebron had tremendous seasons, but with some unproven talent everywhere, it's going to be Kerryon's game for this Lions offense. Look for him to really make some moves. We saw guys a couple years ago, around 2014, 2015, you had Reggie Bush really had a renaissance there. He had a couple good seasons for those Lions. Joique Bell was his compatriot in that backfield, and they were a good tandem. You could have started either one of those guys, whether it be Reggie Bush or Joique Bell, in your backfield when they were splitting time, and you actually would have done just fine. Now Kerryon Johnson really is going to have the reins back there. He has a big chance to have a big season. Of course, you got to see how it plays out. Injuries, defensive matchups, schemes, things like that. But he's a guy that's really poised, like Joe Mixon, to make his name heard in the fantasy football world of running backs. And it's going to be these 4th, 5th round picks, these that are really going to make and break your running back core. Of course, another thing you have to consider is with running backs in the Patriots backfield. You got Sony Michel, you got James White, two guys that honestly you can get them both. They're just like Bell and Bush in Detroit those years ago. They're both startable in that platoon. Sony Michel, we saw a tremendous postseason from him, looking for more as a lead back. James White might fall more into a kind of a Dion Lewis change of pace role, but he's been fantastic as well. I would draft either one of those guys confidently as a running back too, and pair them with someone else and roll in to my fantasy season with a lot of excitement as well. And the last running back to touch on is Phillip Lindsay. He's going late in Yahoo leagues. He's ranked as around the 76th overall in drafts. He's going around the 5th or 6th round. Of course, guys are going down and grabbing him in that 4th spot to round out their running back totals. And he came out of nowhere. He's an undersized running back that really just fell out of the sky and into the Pro Bowl. He was fantastic for the Broncos. He made some people's seasons last year. If you picked him up on free agency or you drafted him as a sleeper pick, he paid off. Now you got to pay a little bit more for him, but he could be worth it. The running back situation in Denver hasn't really seemed to have changed. Royce Freeman's still the backup there, and now with Joe Flacco under center, we still don't really see the weapons in that offense for the Broncos to really take you away from starting Lindsay as either a running back or a flex option. So he's a guy you can wait on. Grab another wideout. Grab a higher end tight end, maybe one of the top 3 of Kittle, Kelsey, and Ertz. Maybe you go grab Hunter Henry a bit early. Just wait on Lindsay. He's a guy that I think is in a good spot to not maybe repeat the success he had, but definitely echo it with another fantastic season. As the running back landscape has really been interesting this fantasy football season. We'll have to see how it all plays out. And we're going to take another short break here on the GSMC Podcast Network, and we'll come back and talk about what you got to do now that you've drafted your teams. But first, we'll take a short break, but we'll be right back with more coverage of fantasy football here on the GSMC Podcast Network.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back as we jump back in here to the Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Davis Ellington here with you as we're going to go into our final segment of the day for fantasy football and talk about the fact that now you've drafted most likely. Now what's next here for your team as you're getting ready week 1, of course, just a couple of days away. Getting all set and ready to go, and it's always tough setting that lineup for week 1. Of course, you've just had a teaspoon of action in that preseason, and now you got to figure out who to start, and that's why we're here to help you out. Of course, now most teams, we're going to start right away with the most open spot of your roster. That's your defensive spot, unless, of course, you drafted the Chicago Bears or the Jacksonville Jaguars defense or maybe the Rams. You want to be pretty open to maneuvering your defenses in and out of your lineup so that you have your best matchups possible. That's the big thing here for teams, and that's not what a lot of people really understand, is that unlike with positions where Your guys are pretty locked into their offensive systems. Yes, you have different cornerbacks, maybe against wide receivers, or different schemes to stack boxes against running backs. Your defenses are facing entirely new teams each and every week. Some play to their strengths, some will expose their weaknesses. And you as a manager, if you want to win those close games, have to be attuned to that. And you have to be versatile on the waiver wire and on the free agent market to make the moves in order to set yourself up for the best week possible. Don't get attached to your defense. The Chicago Bears last season, of course, with the trade for Khalil Mack, they scored an unprecedented amount of points. As a defense, they were fantastic, and they were a weekly starter regardless of who they were really playing. But with that said, so many defenses are not that. The Chicago Bears this season will probably not even be that. It was a real unsustainable pace they set last season. It was amazing to watch, but now with this new season upon you, you have to adjust. Let's say you have a team like the Houston defense, a very solid defensive team. They did trade away Jadeveon Clowney, but they brought in some more people to help them out on that front. And of course, you got J.J. Watt, and if you have J.J. Watt, you have a chance, plain and simple. So now, however, with the Houston defense, Week 1 matchup, you get the Saints. You get Drew Brees, Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, and you are going to have a tough time dealing with that. The Houston defense is projected for just a shade over 3 points right now in Yahoo and ESPN leagues, so you probably don't want to start him. Normally, Drew Brees has a tendency in Week 1s to show off that even though he's getting older, he's still got it, and he's going to be gunslinging, and the Texans really are just not going to be able to stop that Sean Payton, Drew Brees offense. So what you want to do is you want to go to the free agent market. It should be open by now, hopefully, in your leagues. Don't waste a waiver wire move this early in the season on a defense. Let me just be very clear about that right now. If you're going to make these moves, use it in free agency. Don't waste your spot, especially if you're higher up in those top 3 waiver wire spots. You want to cherish those because you're going to need that later on in the year. So don't be afraid to wait and then make your move. Don't jump that gun and utilize that just in Week 1. But what you probably want to do is you want to go to your free agent market. You want to see where their defenses are playing, who their matchups are. One that's probably going to be, 2 of that are probably going to be available for you, actually, that I personally like, and will be starting one myself. You have the Jets against the Bills. Fantastic matchup for the New York Jets. Jamal Adams, you got a great line. The 2 Williams boys are going to be on that front 4 for this New York team as they're really looking to find themselves again defensively. They have a lot of talent, and they're going up against Josh Allen. That's a solid move defensively. You're probably going to get a good amount of points out of that one. The Bills are the Bills, so you can bet against that. You roll that New York Jets defense out there, you're probably going to get some good results. Another team's defense that's poised for a pretty solid week is the Detroit Lions defense. They're going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Kyler Murray's Week 1 debut, Cliff Kingsbury's Week 1 debut. It's going to be pretty rocky most likely for this Cardinals offense trying to get in sync. David Johnson, of course, will be their safety valve back out on the field. Larry Fitzgerald will be trying to keep status quo for the team as well. 2 veteran guys, but with Murray under center, we saw him terrorized by the Raiders in Week 2 with that pass rush. He really hasn't looked terribly comfortable so far. He's really had to adjust to the game. He's undersized at his position as well. Look for the Lions to try to expose that. They're going to try to get a lot of rush in there. Matt Patricia's going to make Kyler Murray feel the heat, be back on his heels, and he could force some turnovers, some sacks, some bad decisions from number 1 behind center. So those 2 teams are really poised for good defensive outbursts in Week 1 that you're also most likely not owned in your league. You use a free agent pick on them. Now it's up to you. You can either drop your defense for another defense, or you can maybe try to sneakily kick one of your sleepers to the curb, one of those late round picks that you've got on your bench, hoping no one picks them up, and then, of course, you can drop your defense after the week and re-grab whoever that person might be and restore the balance to your lineup. But that's something to think about. Rotating defenses are very popular, and they can win you some weeks if you make the right moves. Don't be stagnant in your lineup thinking that your team is your team. It's all about winning each and every week. There is no loyalty in fantasy football on your players. You got to go to the hot hand, and with defenses, that's even more obvious by trying to make moves and expose matchups at that part of the game, because that can get you enough points to really make a big difference. Another position where you can kind of have this running roulette wheel is going to be the quarterback spot. For people that draft more than one quarterback, you're just bringing headaches on yourself. But again, look for those matchups. Look for guys that are poised for a good week and that guys that can attack certain defenses. These are things that are going to be very necessary for teams that don't have a Patrick Mahomes. If you don't have Aaron Rodgers, you got to be willing to make moves, make adjustments on the fly, do the extra research, listen to the extra podcasts, whatever you need to do to make sure that you have all the information to maybe take a flyer on a quarterback one week because of the way certain defenses are probably going to play him or if they have the hot hand. But otherwise, if you just sit back and you just run out your Phillip Rivers style quarterback each and every week, you're going to have lack of production at times because lackadaisical ownership is going to lead to lackadaisical performances from your team as a whole, not just your bench. But you got to be able to have guys on your bench you can rotate in. Look for those matchups. Quarterbacks and defenses are two positions that you can really expose for maximum point values. As long as you're a little ahead of the curve, you do your research on time, you make those moves early, and then you're able to plug and play guys. But for week one, those defenses are solid. Your quarterback that you drafted is probably going to be your guy week one. I don't know why you would draft a quarterback just to move him for week one. A lot of people like to go and get their guy and see how they go from there. But all of this is going to be very interesting as the season goes on. You got to make sure that you're on top of your stuff. Another spot is, of course, your flex position. Watch your bench. Make sure that you know what every single person on your bench is doing, how they're performing, because you got to be able to rotate in and out quickly. See the trends that guys are going. If you have even a great player like Amari Cooper, but if he's having a down time, you got to be able to bench him and know that you got someone else down there that can produce for you at that wide receiver spot or at that flex position. So it's all about variety in fantasy football. You got to be able to move on a dime, change positions, change directions, and make sure that you're putting your team in a position to win each and every week. Defenses and quarterbacks are the two positions that you will see the most of that going on in your league. Don't be sitting idly by watching other teams use the free agent market to their advantage. Take advantage. Go out. Get the best matchups for yourself. Put yourselves in a position to win. And then when it comes playoff time, you'll be in the driver's seat with that, hopefully that first round bye. But that's what you got to do to try to get yourself there. Of course, week one starting up in just a couple of days. We'll be back with more fantasy football podcasts as the season goes on, but that's it for us today. Again, I'm Davis Ellington saying thanks for listening. I hope this has helped with your draft or with your week one preparation, and we'll see you back here on the GSMC Podcast Network for more fantasy football talk in the coming weeks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.